Hi students, and welcome back to this is video 2 of mission 6, looking at muscle physiology. In video 1, we looked at how the parts of anatomy of the muscle, and in this video we're going to be looking at how these muscles actually work. How do they shorten and move your bones? Now you have this diagram, and I had you add this to your digital notes. So this is not within your whole Quest Ones video notes, but what we're looking at, and this is like a giant muscle, looking at down to the muscle fiber level. So I'll get as close up as I can, so where you can see these. But these are the myofibrils. Remember the individual parts of the muscle that you can't see, the microscopic parts of that. And so how your muscles contract and shorten, because remember the purpose of muscles is to move things. We're talking mostly about our skeletal muscles because they're voluntary, and it's easy to really talk about the skeletal muscles right now in this chapter. We also do have, remember, cardiac and smooth muscle, but the skeletal muscles are voluntary. You think about them, you make them move. All of these movements that we do with our body and our face and everything, they're all because of skeletal muscles. So when we're talking about muscles and how they work, their physiology, we're looking at the contraction of the muscle. So wherever you are, either in class or at home, put your hand on your bicep muscle. That's the one here, okay? And, I'm not cut, obviously, so you can't really see the definition, but if you put your arm on your bicep and feel that, move your hand, see if I can get here. Move your arm like this. You're flexing your bicep. Okay, so when you do this, you can feel the muscle getting fatter. Okay, that is contraction of your muscle. Put it this way. There we go. So that's contraction of the muscle. It's getting smaller. When muscles contract, the fibers bunch together, and that makes them feel like they're fat and they're smaller. Now, when you relax the muscle, it extends like this. This would be the extension of your forearm, and that muscle got long and thin. It didn't feel all fat. So contraction is when it's bunched up and fat. Relaxation is when it's extended and elongated. So this process of how they do this is very complicated. And so in your notes, you've got these boxes that I've filled in the words for you because it's more than you really need to understand, or not understand, but need to remember. I'm going to give you some points to remember at the end of the video. So I know this sounds like a lot of big words and a lot of nonsense, but just hang with me and stick to the end, and then I'll tell you like the vital points for you to remember, because I do want you to remember some of this stuff. So this diagram, you're going to be dragging the boxes. The first thing that happens, and remember, since these are voluntary movements, are, how do we move it? Well, we send our brain sends a message down these neurons, which are part of the nervous system, that will come in very close contact to each muscle. And in each muscle fiber has a bunch of different neurons associated with it. So this picture in number 1 up here, the blank that goes there, the one you should be dragging, is the one that says nerve impulse arrives at the axon terminal. That's the end of the axon, which is part of your nerve here. And it releases a chemical called acetylcholine, and that's abbreviated ACH. That chemical is going to move across this space here and actually bind to receptors on the muscle. So that's the first thing that happens. So it shows you the nerve impulse is traveling along the membrane of the muscle. Remember, that's the epimysium, and it's going to go deep within the muscle to get to the microscopic parts. The next thing that happens, ACH, that's our abbreviation for that chemical, acetylcholine, will diffuse across the cleft, what I just said, binds to receptors on the motor end plate, and causes a muscle action potential. Action potentials are how nerves send their impulse. We'll talk more about that in the nervous system. But basically, it's an electrical event, electrical and chemical event that causes a nerve transmission and nerve impulse to travel down the length of the muscle. The next thing, number 3, acetylcholinesterase is an enzyme that'll break that down. You have to have it be broken down to be re-released to keep the muscle contracting. So that's what happens. This enzyme will destroy that acetylcholine that's in there and allow another nerve impulse to send the message to release more acetylcholine so that contraction will eventually happen. So this is just the very first part of this muscle contraction. It hasn't actually done anything yet. It's sending the message by releasing this chemical that's moving across from the neuron into the muscle. So let's look specifically at what happens when that ACH, that acetylcholine, hits a muscle. So step number 4, this action potential travels down these structures called T-tubules in the muscle, and it releases calcium. That's a big thing that you'll need to remember. Calcium is the ion, the mineral ion that your muscles need for contraction. It's the same mineral ion that is stored in your bones, and that is why your bones store that mineral, because you need calcium for muscle contraction. And, like I said, we're talking about skeletal muscles, but remember that your heart is a muscle too. If your heart does not have calcium, it cannot beat and you die. So calcium is very important. And that's why it's important to eat it in your diet. If you don't have enough in your diet to support muscle contraction, then your body will pull the calcium from your bones in order for your heart to keep beating. Kind of important deal there. And that can lead to troubles as you get older called osteoporosis, where your bones get brittle because the calcium is being pulled out to have your heart beat and you're not eating it in your diet. Anyway, the calcium is released because of this action potential, the nerve impulse traveling, and that is going to allow calcium ions to just go right into the muscle, to flood them, is what that's talking about there. Now you see a picture of the muscle fiber here, number 5, and when you look in close view, and I know this picture is not the most clear, but this should look familiar. You labeled it in your other diagram. You have these thick filaments here. Remember, those are called what? Yes, those are called myosin filaments. And then these here are the thin filaments. And what are the thin filaments called? Yes, those are called actin. So this is a close-up view of the actin and myosin myofilaments that you see on a muscle fiber here. The next step then is this calcium that has flooded into the muscles will bind to another chemical called troponin, and that's on the thin filament. And when calcium binds to that, it's going to cause the actin to have these exposed sites. So if you consider, here's troponin and here's actin, before calcium gets here, it looks like this. Well, when calcium shows up, the troponin moves out of the way, and there's this empty binding site that you need to have in order for muscles to contract. So we'll come back to that in just a second. Number 6 then shows you what happens. So here's the relaxed muscle, and then notice that the fibers look a little different here between step 5 and step 6. These thin filaments have moved toward the middle of the thick filament area because that binding site that I showed you was open. That thick filament myosin now can come in and bind to it, and it pulls the myosin pulls the actin towards the middle of that sarcomere. Remember, the sarcomere is this repeating unit of muscle fiber. And so when the myosin binds to that empty spot, ATP, remember ATP is used for what? Energy, yes. ATP is always the energy compound. So when ATP is formed, it's there. This myosin binds to the empty spot. The ATP causes the myosin to move and slide the filament towards each other. So you start out here. These are your thin filaments, okay, separated. And when myosin does its binding trick with ATP, it goes shoop, and it pulls those actin filaments towards each other. And that's what shortens the muscle. When you felt your muscle doing this and you flexed or contracted your bicep and you felt it get, thick and fat, it got short because those actin filaments went shoop, because you told it to. Remember, these are voluntary movements. That is actual contraction of muscle when those thin filaments slide past each other and bunch up. And that is all because of calcium and ATP. Now, it doesn't stay like that. Your muscles don't constantly contract. They do have to relax. And that happens when, after this whole contraction happens, then those calcium channels will close. And there's a pump there that will pump the calcium out. Now, it is active transport. It's an active transport mechanism. Remember, we talked about these different movements of things in and out of cells, and we're talking about muscle cells here, so these still apply. And remember that things could be passive or active. If it's active, what does it need to do in order to work? It's going from high to low or low to high? Yes, it's going from low to high. So in order to pump it out, it has to use ATP. So ATP is used to bind this here and make it happen, and also used to pump out the calcium back where it was before, so muscle contraction can happen over and over again. It is all dependent on this level of calcium in the muscles. So because all this ATP is going on, it requires a lot of energy for you to contract your muscles. If you're working out, running, lifting weights, and doing things beyond your normal muscle movements, that requires a lot of energy. And so you need to take in more energy with healthy food. And that's why if you don't do that, then you feel very tired later. Then the next thing that happens, number 8, the troponin-tropomyosin complex will slide back into position to get ready for another round of contraction. Once it does that, remember we had this here, the calcium moved it away, the myosin could come in and slide it past. Well, then that goes away and it slides back, it's empty, and the troponin can come back in and bind again. And it just keeps going over and over and over again for you to contract muscles. Then the last thing is that the muscle relaxes. So again, a lot of detail, a lot of things you don't really need to know, but I want to tell you what you do need to know on the bottom of the screen here. As soon as that goes away. There we go. So what I need to know. So type this in the text box that you have below there. The first thing is nerve impulses cause calcium to be released from the muscle. That's your number one thing. I want you to know that it's a nerve impulse that's doing it, and it's releasing calcium. The second thing, calcium causes the binding sites on actin to be exposed. Remember, that's the thin filament. The third, myosin binds to the exposed sites on the actin, and they pull using ATP. So the thick filament binds to the thin filament and pulls it, which makes it slide together and get that fat, short muscle during contraction. And the final thing is that pulling action causes the sarcomere, that repeating unit, to shorten, which contracts the muscle. Now, we were talking about this contraction here. So feel in your elbow, right here in the middle, there's this really thick cord that's a tendon that attaches your bicep to your radius. Remember that bone that's on the thumb side of your arm? Okay, so if you feel down in your skin, you can feel that tendon where it's kind of going towards your bone. So that's attachment. This is, we talked about joints in the last chapter, or the last mission about bones and joints, that you have these tendons. These are thick cords of connective tissue that connect a muscle to a bone. So we have this tendon here that connects our bicep muscle to this bone, the radius. So when this muscle contracts and gets shorter, it pulls on the bone, which is what allows you to make this movement with your arm. This is called flexing. When you decrease the angle, that's flexing. Okay, I'll talk about the other thing in another video. So that's basically all you need to know about muscle physiology. Yes, there was a lot of detail, but just pin it down to those 4 main things. All right, this ends the video 2, and so the next video we will talk about these specific muscle movements.